In a time of an upheaval, will come a transformation. Ignite a fire that will burn like the sun. Become a strong movement, fierce and determined, informed by where we are and where we've come from. We are those who are rising from Manila to Miami, building trust and solidarity. Love is our bond. And in the streets we are marching to end the rape and the suffering, to stop the fascist tyranny. Organize as one. We are rising. We are rising. We are rising now. And in this life. From those who dare to interrupt the violence, to those who expose the truth and break the silence, warriors who work to open up the prison bars, valiant souls who stand up against the unjust wars, multitudes who defy walls along the border, masses who unify to protect our water, rebel minds who unionize for workers' rights, fearless hearts who fight to defend trans lives, those who take back their land and their health, those who seek to redistribute the wealth, youth who demand a right to education, those who reclaim political power in their nation. We cry out, say her name. We chant love, trust, hate, and we will not be erased. It's we who decide our fate. We are rising. We are rising. We are rising now. And in this life, we are rising. We are rising. We are rising now. And in this life, we are women who endured violence and degradation, slavery, trafficking and mutilation, rape and abuse, racist discrimination, those who survived labor exploitation, colonization and gentrification, imprisonment, migration and militarization, homophobia and transphobic aggression, violence by police, reproductive oppression. But from the pain we will open eyes, awaken hearts and awaken minds, and that demands we intensify. Strategically we are organized, together we can raise the vibration through our action and imagination, respect, trust and communication, and love for our future generations. Intersectional, inclusive, we come. Collective power is how this is won. We keep it rising like the fire of the sun. We will rise like the sun. We will rise like the sun. One for a billion, a billion for one. 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 Rising. We are rising now. And in this life, we are rising. We are
It is the expectation of the Southwest Center for Human Relations Studies
that all participants of NCORE enjoy a welcoming and inclusive environment,
free from all forms of discrimination, harassment, and retaliation.
NCORE is committed to fostering an atmosphere that encourages the free expression and exchange of ideas.
In pursuit of that ideal,
NCORE is committed to the promotion of equality of opportunity and treatment for all NCORE participants and NCORE-sponsored events,
regardless of gender,
gender identity or expression,
race,
color,
national or ethnic origin,
religion or religious belief,
age,
marital status,
sexual orientation,
immigration status,
disabilities,
veteran status,
or body size.
Start the conversation.
Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. I am Dr. Jenny Rungo, the Executive Director of the Southwest Center and Director of NCORE, and I'm very delighted to be your host today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, NCORE offers 2 webinars per month on the first and last Wednesday. In October, we have 3 webinars after rescheduling one from last month. Our Emerging Scholars webinars are held on the first Wednesday, and they focus on ideas that speak directly to the experiences of students. These webinars are either facilitated or co-facilitated by a student and are intended to identify emerging scholars. These are always available at no cost. Our off-the-schedule webinar that is rescheduled from last month will be presented on October 14th, multiple front lines, everything involved in what we call online learning. We shall have a panel of faculty members address the experiences and strategies for online learning. On October 28th, we shall present Race, Class, Gender, and Media, Teaching Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Media and Communication Studies. Please visit our website, www.ncore.ou.edu, for the full list of featured webinars for this season. I would like to request that you use the chat box to tell us where you're joining us from. Also tweet, Instagram, or share with the hashtag NCORE, start the conversation online. It is incredibly important for us to stay connected, especially during these uncertain times. I'm glad to say that today we are hosting doctoral candidate Jennifer Batchelder from Florida State University. Jennifer will explore a different approach to developing leadership in the Latinx student population. Her topic is a generative approach to Latinx student leadership development. The center is very grateful for her expertise. Please post questions in the Q&A box and she will address them at the end of the presentation. I also want to let you know that we do have ASL and Captioner available for this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. And now I would want to request Jennifer to start her presentation. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you. It is such an honor to be here with y'all today. My name is Jennifer Batchelder. I identify as she, her, ella, and I am a Chicana Latina leadership educator. She said, I am a doctoral candidate studying higher education at Florida State University. And I will get started by sharing my screen. Okay. I am really excited to talk with you about a generative approach to Latin student leadership development, particularly with the celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month going on, as the nation is really becoming more conscious of the importance of recognizing and practicing culturally relevant approaches to understanding and engaging with our world. And so if you got to show up early, I got to play a beautiful piece by Diana Asila, and she's a social justice activist artist. And we got to kind of listen to some of her music in celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month and in recognition of some of the challenges that many of our minoritized populations are currently experiencing. So diving into my topic of a generative leadership approach, I do want to highlight my purpose, which is to challenge the Western understandings of leadership development using generativity as the community cultural wealth model as a theoretical framework to understand a different approach to developing leadership in Latin student population. Now, you might be wondering why I'm using this term Latin. You'll see that I have in my screen, in my presentation, an asterisk. It's pronounced Latin, and I'm using it as an all-inclusive ethnic identity to refer to a group of people from the Caribbean, Mexico, Central America, and South America. The asterisk is based on research by Salinas, who published this year his studies on the use of the term Latinx, Latina, Latino, Latinat, Hispanic, several different identifying terms, and found that especially using the X, there were many misunderstandings and misusings of the term Latinx, and recommended an asterisk instead of X to reduce the confusion while continuing to be all-inclusive of gender fluidity. So that's why I'm using that term, though I do honor and recognize other scholars and the way they pronounce Latino or Latinat or some other concepts throughout the presentation, because there's a political and personal association with the use. So in my presentation, I am going to help us to consider the barriers in Latin students' experiences, especially in understanding leadership from a Western lens. I'm gonna define the 6 capitals of community cultural wealth in application to the Latin population. We're gonna describe the components of generativity and its relation to the community cultures. And then we're going to discuss the application of generative leadership and a cultural approach to benefit the leadership development of Latin students. So to get started, I wanted to do a engagement with y'all and just ask a little bit about what some of the barriers y'all might think of, even if you've never really thought about it. What are some things you might think of as barriers to leadership education when you're considering culture? So if you can go to slido.com, either on your phone or on your computer, and type in this code 32603, that should bring you into my conversation. Affordability, representation, professional equals whiteness. Yeah, a lot of times the leadership is associated with professionalism, access to information on what it takes to be a leader, maybe. Second-class citizen, so when you're considering leader as a title, the people below you may be seen as second class or lower than. Microaggressions definitely are present when, whether or not we're conscious of it, whether we're doing it with intentionality or not. Let's see, definitely representation, access, whiteness, understanding. How are we understanding leadership? Microaggressions, imposter syndrome. Yep, I definitely see that showing up. Give it a few more moments. Cost. Yeah, cost is also a challenge because, you know, education in general, there's a cost in several different forms that kind of show up when we think about access to understanding leadership. Supremacist culture. Yes, again, kind of thinking about the hierarchy components. If our students are really focusing on hierarchy and how some might be supremacist in thinking that they're better than. Stereotypes, yes. Access, understanding. Lack of support, the unconscious bias, right? So whether or not we're doing things intentionally or not. Sexism. poverty, othering, familiar expectations. That one's interesting. Okay. All right. Thank you for those contributions. It will be live a little bit longer, so if y'all want to kind of keep posting in there, you can do that. So I'm going to continue back to the slide. So thank y'all so much for each of those different themes that really showed up. They definitely highlight several of the barriers that I'm going to be speaking about here. So when we're thinking about leadership studies, which is the foundation for an educator to distribute to their students, right? When we're thinking about the studies of leadership, it's often found or predominantly founded on Western perspectives and experiences. So the scholars, the author, the historical perspective on leadership theory is founded often by white male privileged men. I said male already, but you know, that narrative is historical, and we're building off of that. And so when we're thinking about leadership from other perspectives, from other cultures, it's going to be excluding the experiences of minority populations. Those stories, those voices are not written in text, maybe because it's not a cultural practice, or because they weren't historically given that access, you know, centuries ago when we started some of the foundational pieces of leadership education. And so with the exclusion, we're leaving out those voices, and as we're educating on Western perspectives of leadership, we are challenging the students to relate to something that is against their cultural practices, against what's innate or easy for them to come to. So as we start looking at other literature that isn't from the Western perspectives, there's still a lack of literature. Now, I argue that it is thriving. It is starting to become present and in our field, but even the little literature that is on Latin leadership is not widely utilized or considered. And so when we think about leadership education across the nation, most of them are using, again, the Western perspectives of leadership, and they're not incorporating these other voices and other perspectives. So like some of the themes that are showing up, there's not representation. The students are seeing themselves. They're not relating as easily to the concepts or the ideas. And so, you know, those are some of the barriers that they're facing. And I'm going to dive into that a little bit more as I kind of explore some of these concepts. Looking at leadership, I do want to highlight how the evolution of formal leadership theory has grown significantly in the past several centuries, from great man theory, where we're really based on traits, being male, being born into leadership positions, all the way to 1978 when there was a shift and we started to really understand leadership from a relational aspect. So there's a reciprocal process. We're starting to understand there's different situations that call for different types of leadership, right? But and with that, I do want to acknowledge two common leadership definitions. Rost is known for his research in leadership, and over a century did research on leadership definitions, and has come to this definition that is used in leadership education today. It's that leadership is an influence relationship among leaders and followers who intend real changes that reflect their mutual purposes. So I'm letting that sink in for just a moment. I think that's I think that there is a really great thought and intent in that definition. We also look towards the social change model, which is very widely used in leadership education and higher education, where leadership is described as a purposeful, collaborative, values-driven process instead of a title or position. And I think these two definitions have really helped to demonstrate how we've progressed from, you know, the great man theory traits being born into leadership, into understanding the relational process and the community orientation, right? That that leadership our goal of leadership is, what our goal is of practicing leadership. And so when we think about leadership education, we're trying to help students to really understand some of these different components within this definition. But I think that it is important to note that Western understandings of leadership have only just begun to understand leadership in a manner that cultural leadership views have been practicing for centuries. And this is based off of the work by Juana Borges in her Salsa, Soul, and Spirit book on multicultural leadership. She really establishes the, or really vocalizes the challenge that, yes, you know, leadership theories in this Western understanding is really just starting to get to what we've been practicing for centuries and centuries, from the Black community, the Native American community, and the Latin community. So, you know, I think that that is an important recognition to make. And as we start understanding where students are innate in, what their innate cultural practices are, and how that can come into play into their understanding of leadership, may be a really great way to start helping those students to understand leadership. And what I want to move into is talking about leadership from a Latin student perspective. So Armino in 2000 did a study on students of colors and their understanding of the term leadership. And they found that the term leader was something they disdained, they did not like, they resisted using that term, often because it focused on issues associated with individualism and personal gain, rather than working toward a community benefit. And that was a big challenge for them because the community orientation is something that's very innate, a very big value of theirs. And so when they're getting introduced to leadership and being a leader from a very individualistic perspective and from personal gain, they were resistant to it. In 2015, Lozano did another research study on specifically the definitions, how Latina students considered their cultural definition of leadership. And the findings really spoke to how they understood it as holistic, action-oriented, serving, caring for their community, motivating, inspiring others, collaboration, community, and empowerment. And of course, not based on a position or hierarchy. In my teachings in Latinx leadership, in the leadership in change class that has a mixture of different identities, and in the studies that I found, I see these things very, very regularly. So, you know, the definition that we're looking, these ideas that kind of build these students' ideas on leadership aren't something that we as leadership educators are against. This is something that is beautiful, that does kind of speak to the definition that Rost and Comives et al. Came to, right? So some of those ideas very much align with what we want our students to know and practice. Then very recently, Acosta and Guthrie discovered how, in looking at Latin students' leadership identity development, they do move through identity development in very similar ways. However, it was significantly influenced when cultural heritage was considered, because they saw it as an important, inseparable part of who they were as a leader. So not addressing those cultural pieces is something that makes leadership unapproachable for these students as far as learning, formal learning, practicing, and even taking ownership in what they're doing as a form of leadership. So when we link it to that cultural component and when we link it to community orientations, that's where we can really make significant growth in these students' understanding of leadership. As I move through my presentation, I'm going to focus on some key concepts. So leadership, I don't want to give a formal definition because I'm trying to give my students, as always as a leadership educator, more ownership. But based off of some of the previous slides' explanations on leadership, I describe it as a relational process that is with and for the community and does not require a positional role. I'm going to describe that a bit more specifically from a Latino lens or Latin lens in just a moment. I also recommend taking an asset-based approach, and that's why I pull in the community cultural wealth model, where knowledge is used by communities of color to survive oppression. And those experiences really speak to the type of leadership these students are innately capable of. And I also speak about this concept called generativity, which takes a community-oriented approach, thinking about these cultures as community-oriented, and helps to understand their practice, their cultural practice of guiding the next generation. Again, I'm going to talk more about each of those specifically. Diving further into leadership from a Latino perspective, Juana Bordes does use her book on the power of Latino leadership to describe principles of Latino leadership. And it starts with a foundation in knowing who you are and where you came from, knowing your culture and what that culture brings to you. And from that foundation, Latinos can move into action with their leadership. She describes Juntos, which is community stewardship, collective community stewardship, excuse me. And this really speaks to the cultural value of family and community. Again, it's a community-oriented culture, so building strong relationships with others and finding ways to get together and collaborate and work together is a really important piece of it. We also have adelante, which is moving forward, is a Spanish term, moving forward, which really speaks to the global vision and immigrant spirit of our community. The global vision meaning the Latino culture is actually a combination of many countries, kind of fusing together some of the best pieces to kind of figure out how we're gonna create change. And so that's that global vision, but then also considering that immigrant spirit and what it takes to be an immigrant and how many things you have to overcome in order to maintain who and where you are. Then we have Si se puede. This is something that we might have heard around, but Si se puede is yes we can, it just translates to yes we can. But this speaks to social activism and coalition leadership. So activism, especially the way that we're looking at minoritized populations and the things that they overcome as a way to enhance their perspective on leadership. Si se puede is thinking about activism, maybe not the term leadership, but activism even, as a way of practicing leadership. And coalition leadership, meaning I'm not doing this alone. I'm gonna work to find other people who have a similar passion so we can unite and build, collaborate to confront our challenges. So that's that community spirit. All right, so next she describes gozar la vida, which is the celebration of life. I love this, this principle because in leadership, we often forget that celebration is a really big part of creating change. There might be steps along the way, and we need to also celebrate large and small accomplishments. And so that's very inherent with the Latin community, is celebrating. So that gives us motivation for something to look forward to and moments of reflection to understand what we've accomplished. And finally, she describes fe y esperanza, which speaks to faith and hope. And this is really a form of like resilience. It might have, for some people, a very religious tone to it, but others it is simply spiritual. And those two are very different, but can overlap. This is what gives you the motivation, the encouragement, the humility, the courage, the gratitude to keep going and persisting in the pursuit of change. And so with those components of leadership in mind, I moved to describing community cultural wealth. Yoso explains how this is an array of knowledge, skills, abilities, and contacts possessed and utilized by communities of color to survive and resist macro and micro forms of oppression. And so, yes, we do consider the lived experiences of oppression and how that may be negative, but we can learn and grow from how we overcome. So in her model, she thinks a little bit differently about wealth. Oftentimes, we really think about wealth from an economic perspective, but really we invest ourselves, not money, ourselves in other people, in understandings, in relationships. And so these are the types of wealth that she really is focusing on in her model. She also takes a different lens to understanding culture. A lot of times when we're thinking about different identities, we think of deficit approaches. So maybe some of the negative aspects or stereotypes, negative stereotypes of cultures. But if we think about it in a different way, we can use asset-based approach to really celebrate what these different communities and cultures are actually bringing to the community, to themselves, in order to overcome challenges and make accomplishments and achieve success. So in her model, she describes 6 different forms of capital. First is aspirational capital, and this really speaks to the ability to actually have aspirations or goals. You might not think that is a huge value, but really it is when you get less opportunities and still have the optimism to find hope and see yourself accomplishing something. That is a form of capital that you contribute and collect from your community. There's also the familial capital. With the Latino culture, Latin culture, there is a huge value on family. And so, you're spending time getting to know and building up and empowering everyone in your family, from various different generations, from immediate to extended family who aren't even blood related, and finding ways to support one another. That sometimes leads into the cultural capital. You'll see that several of these do overlap, but the social capital. So the social capital does speak to your network. And so some of your extended family may be in your social capital as well, but this really speaks to the type of people that you reach out to when you need advice or support or resources. Who do you know who maybe knows somebody who can help you find the answer to a question that you need to answer? So, I think about in education in general, first generation college students struggle with filling out applications or knowing which schools to apply for. So who do they talk to? Who's their network? Who do they get that information from? Which also speaks to the navigational capital. Within higher education, Latino culture or Latin culture and other minoritized cultures are not the first people that were thought of when the education systems were designed. It was designed for white men primarily, and the systems that established it are still continuing to be perpetuated. And so the capital of navigation is to be able to navigate through systems that weren't designed for you. How are you using your ingenuity, your creativity, your social capital network to continue to navigate through different challenges and find the resilience to push through, right? Then we also have resistance capital. This one speaks to the recognition of unjust experiences as related to your culture or as related to an identity or something that you hold close to yourself. So the resistance capital kind of takes the navigational capital a step further. Yes, you can navigate through it, but can you name it and can you call it out and can you work to create change on it? That's that resistant capital. And then finally, the linguistic capital, which with the Latin culture, we have the Spanish language. as one of the language within Latin culture. And for those in the United States specifically, oftentimes in higher education, they are bilingual. So they may have had Spanish either as their first language or as a paired language that they commonly use throughout their lives. And the bilingual ability gives these students the capacity to bring cultures together because they understand both English and Spanish. They can also translate in their minds very quickly, think and write and read and communicate in general in different languages. Also code switch, understanding reading the room efficiently to know how to respond and how to talk in order to get a point across. Also with the linguistic capital, we move beyond just language, but also into the act of storytelling. So with storytelling, I think about, growing up, we had so many different stories from, different scary stories, La Llorona, and different things that, we were told when we were little, when we were children, but also learning about the different stories of my ancestors, my great-great-grandmother, and how, I get her ingenuity and her persistence and drive from her and from the different things that I learned from the stories my parents, my aunt, my grandma has told me. So, that storytelling capital really does contribute to who I am. And each of these 6 capitals contribute to community cultural wealth. So the community that you're engaging with gets to benefit collectively from this information. And each individual both contributes and benefits from cultural capital. So this is the model that I am really trying to apply here, one of the models that I'm really trying to apply here in my conceptual framework. I'm going to give it just a moment for y'all to take a look at this. So I want to ask y'all, I'm going to ask y'all the question. I'll slide right back to this so you can think for a moment. I want to, for the next Slido, I want to ask y'all, which community cultural wealth capital do you relate to? And so I'll slide back to that. I have to exit so I can transition to the next. There you go. So which of the cultural wealth capitals do you relate to? And you should be able to select more than one if you would like. Yeah, that familial capital is definitely dominating here. I'm not sure if that's going to change any as we kind of continue to see our participants engage with this activity. The aspirational or having goals, the ability, recognizing that your ability to have goals and aspire, even maybe despite some of your challenges, is second. Then we have the social capital, definitely recognizing who is in our network and how we're utilizing them to perhaps use way down the bottom, navigational capital, resistant capital, considering our linguistic capital. I didn't get to ask who all we're being joined with. So I think that this is a really great layout or demonstration. I have not specifically said, okay, Latino community or Latin community, please answer this. I have asked everybody to, and regardless of your identities, it's looking like most of y'all were able to identify with one. Let's see what this bottom one says. I don't think, we've got 1%. So very few of us are not able to relate in some way, shape, or form to this model. And I think that's an important consideration as we start thinking about using this when we think about leadership education. So now I'm going to move into talking about generativity. And I do want to state that it is primarily focused on guiding or mentoring the next generation. So I want to ask you to pause for a moment. I'm going to do another Slido and think about, where do you see this in your life? So are you guiding anybody? Are you mentoring anybody with intention? Are you building relationships with others so that you can share information with the next generation, or whether that's cohorts or baby boomers, all the way down to Gen Z. How do you see this in your life? This one's a little bit of a deeper question, so I'll give y'all a little bit more time to think about that one. As a student affairs professional. Yeah, I can see that because our profession is really, I also am a student affairs professional. We are going into this profession with the intention of developing students, right? As a mentor, as a professor, staying in touch with your prior students, right? Yeah, definitely. These are some, staying in touch with them. That's a harder piece, and the fact that you're continuing those relationships is really important. Helping them following through. Your mom, helping younger family members. Yes, that's very common. Definitely seeing it within the family members. Leading Latina peer-to-peer mentoring supervisor. Currently doing this now as academic advising in HS and college, high school and college. Personally with younger siblings, yeah, definitely. In the work that I do outside of your functional area, can't achieve without being on my community along, bringing your community along, right? So are we really accomplishing much if we're just enhancing our own abilities without bringing your community along? That's beautiful. With your little sister in student organization. In student organization, this is something that I am doing my research on, is looking at these ideas within the boundaries of student organizations. Not necessarily with just leaders, because we understand that the Latin community understands leadership from both a relational and a positional aspect. So just student organization involvement in general. As a peer mentor, community resource exchange, and now randomly helping friends with what I can, right? Advising students in high school setting, right? Stepdaughters, definitely. Previous K through 12 education in general, lots of passing down knowledge, right? Peer mentoring, dreamer organization, that's wonderful. And so if you're considering guiding the next generation, you're trying to help other dreamers, right? But also hopefully you're bringing along others to help them understand the value of what you're trying to create change in, so that they can find the community and support that they need. Admissions specialist, awesome. Okay. Continuing to sing the songs of tribal leaders. They've taught me and share our ways. That is beautiful, yes. Passing down these values and practices from generation to generation. Like I said, I know stories from my ancestors that have been passed down to me that can also, be from various different types of things that you've been taught and learned through the different generations in your family as a graduate advisor. Connecting Latin alumni with Latin students, wonderful, yes. To get the support they need through the educational experience and the larger community support, wonderful. Passing down my knowledge about educational system, financial aid, navigational capital, definitely, yes. And that's a lot of these things are what these students need. They need people to help guide them so that they can navigate through, and then hopefully pass it on forward. So I'm going to continue with my presentation. Thank y'all for those pieces of engagement. So my introduction to this idea on generativity actually started in my master's program, when I started. I did take a leadership class in my master's program, and we touched on the leadership identity development model. And in this model, Comives et al. Describes 6 different stages that students, specifically college students, go through in order to understand leadership. So they start with an awareness. This is usually in childhood, recognizing that leadership is happening around me. Maybe that's likely their parents. Then they start engaging and exploring leadership. And this might have been, I joined the soccer team, or I'm trying music, or I'm joining these different organizations. This is, throughout childhood and adolescence. Usually stage 3, leader identified. This is when students start being and in their leadership identity in college. This is when they start identifying what it means to be a leader. So they're thinking about that definition, being a little bit more conscious about it. As they move into the 4th stage, they differentiate leadership, which means they start seeing leadership being leadership begins to be viewed as a group effort. So it's differentiated from positional as they start seeing it as a relational process. Typically, college students graduate at either stage 3 or 4, according to the LID research, the Leadership Identity Development research. Then stage 5 is generativity. This is where I started seeing this word, taking responsibility for developing leadership in others and having a passion for the group objectives. And when I saw this word, I was like, oh my gosh, I know this. I do this all the time. This is what I do. I don't know why, I just do it. And other people, gave me that affirmation as well. And I thought, well, that's weird. It's down here in the 5th stage and not very many people get to it. So I thought that was kind of odd. Then, the 6th stage, which again, students will kind of flow through each of these, but the 6th stage is harder to get to. But this is when they start integrating and synthesizing leadership as a part of their identity and in a lifelong process. So they'll use it throughout their lives, not just when they're in a student organization or in their work role. They'll use it throughout. And when I started, I think I mentioned, I teach a Latin leadership class, and I am honored that I get to explore leadership through this cultural lens. And I took on this challenge of exploring these students' leadership identity development in an activity. So I had them think about where they were in high school and where they are now. So I would have them chart, in a chart, plot, how did they understand leadership in high school? Did they think it meant having a position, or that leadership was taught or was going on anywhere in the group? That's that community-oriented piece. Or, yeah, position or anywhere in the group, sorry, leader or follower aspect. Then on the x-axis, I suppose, it's actually the why. Why are you getting involved? Are you trying to get involved because you have a focus on yourself or a focus on the group, creating change for the group? And according to the LID model, a typical student would move through their identity through this line. Starting with a focus on self and having a position, understanding leadership in that way, in themselves. And then starting to see it as, oh, I can practice leadership anywhere, and I really do want to focus on the group. But there are suggestions that Latin students have a different starting point. And so when I did this activity with my students in the class, I thought it was fascinating because, yeah, these students really do start with a focus on the group rather than on themselves. There were, and that I've done this 3 times, there were some students who actually went this way. I'm going to pause and let y'all kind of think. Why do you think some of the students might have gone from this way, from focus on the group and having a position, down to focus on self and maybe a little bit more towards the group? You don't have to type that anywhere. I'm just trying to get you to kind of think a little bit. And again, the context that I've been doing this activity is within my Latinx student leadership class. So with these students, a lot of the times my Latin students would confirm this line, going from having a position and highly focused on the group down to leadership being anywhere and leadership focusing on the group. All the way to, and then we had a couple of students who had that same starting point, but moved backwards. And these students were my international students. These were my students who started in their Latin cultures, or heavily in their culture, because they were in their country when they grew up. And these are the ideas that they had when they were in their homelands, in their home country. And then as they came to the United States, these were some of their reflections. They started to really understand it more as, still resisting on having the position side, but definitely having a more focus on the self. And so those perspectives really speak volumes in, where their starting points of understanding leadership is. So I think understanding leadership, starting with understanding leadership from a focus on the group, from that community orientation, is a really important piece. And so that's why I dove even further into understanding generativity, because I started making that connection between my own culture and why it related because of that community orientation. So generativity is a concept that actually derives from aging theory. So Erik Erikson in the 1950s explored the lifespan and found that in middle adulthood, adults started taking information and realizing that they're retiring, and they have so much information and a different type of wealth and knowledge that they wanted to start passing on to the next generation so that it could continue to live on and that maybe their vision would continue. And so that kind of established the research on generativity, but we found out that since then, in the decades of history of research, we have found that generativity is actually practiced throughout the lifespan in various different ways. And so as I explored the literature more, I kind of came up with a highlight of 6 practices of generativity. And it's first that generativity is a process of guiding. So it involves at least 2 people in a communication process of some sort, exchanging information. It's also the pursuit of positive well-being. So this is basically identifying a goal or an objective, something that maybe is not right and how we want to improve it. And ideally it's positive. You're not trying to destruct anything. And it's well-being, thinking not so much about things, but people and the betterment of our environments. It's also mutually beneficial. So the 2 people involved, the guider and the guidee, get a benefit. The guider is passing information to the guidee that they need in order to move forward, right? But the guider is getting a benefit through a sense of fulfillment in sharing their information. It's also future and other oriented. So when we're thinking about the pursuit of positive well-being as our goal, it's something that's a little bit more distant, probably will take a bit of time, perhaps even a couple of generations, especially when we're thinking about the accomplishments of minoritized populations and how we've gotten to where we are today. Those goals are long-term, future-oriented. It's also other-oriented as we're thinking about that why we're pursuing a positive well-being. It's not for selfish reasons. It's really thinking about others and the community and how we're really benefiting them. And maybe you benefit because you're a part of it as well. It's also enduring. So it takes a lot of endurance in order to persist and overcome, persist in overcoming barriers. But it also calls for an enduring practice in that when you learn information, you share it. Sometimes when we learn information, it is a form of power. When you know how to do something, people come to you, so you're the go-to person because you know how to do something. Well, if you share that knowledge, that power with others, then they can be empowered to continue to make that pursuit of positive well-being continue in that goal for that community. So you're passing on knowledge and you're also inspiring others in pursuit of that positive well-being. And finally, it's celebrating. And this one definitely overlaps with the Gozar la Vida practice, Latino leadership practice, where we are having celebrations to look forward to, but also celebrations as a moment of reflection in what we, in recognition of what we've accomplished. So those are some really kind of active pieces that I've recognized in the literature. I do have to note that the literature is very dominantly white, male, or Western perspectives. And as I compared this to the cultural aspects, I was intentional about ensuring that I was finding some commonalities there. I do want to speak to the different types of generativity that kind of elaborates more on this cultural connection. So in the research on generativity, there's 4 different ways to practice generativity. First is biological. So this is the biological ability for a female to give birth to the next generation. Next is parental. So not necessarily biological parents, but parental figures and their ability to nurture and discipline children and help them kind of navigate through childhood to adulthood. And technical generativity, this is speaking to the teaching of skills and abilities from one group to the next. So when we're talking about student affairs and when we're talking about K through 12 education, mentoring, we're teaching specific skill sets or abilities, right? Then there's the cultural generativity. And this one really speaks to a technical generativity, but instead of teaching skills and abilities, cultural generativity teaches values, norms, and beliefs in order to help the next generation to move through their lifespan. And with that information in mind, I bring together all 3 of these ideas, the community cultural wealth model, and Latin leadership, but with a specific Latin lens, with a mediator of generativity. And as I bring them together, I've proposed a conceptual framework. And this is what's really driving my dissertation research as an emerging scholar. And in my own practice and understanding, I believe in Latino leadership. I believe that connection is clear and it is practicing, but from the college student perspective, they are not seeing that very clearly because the social construction of leadership and the practice of leadership from their peers and in their environment is that it's very positional and very distant to them. So they don't make that connection to their own identity, to leadership. So I make that connection between the culture, community cultural wealth, and leadership with a dotted line. But I use generativity as a mediator between these 2 ideas, the culture and leadership. And the practices of these different capitals really align with these concepts of generativity. And the Latino leadership heavily aligns with a lot of the practices of generativity. So I know there's a lot to take in here. I'm gonna pause and let y'all kind of soak it in. Take a sip of water. And now I can talk a little bit more about it. So looking at the aspirational capital, to have aspirations, these students use generativity as a pursuit of positive well-being, which aligns with the generative second practice, and thinks about the future. So that's the future orientation. Familial capital is really thinking about the community orientation, so other-oriented, as an encouragement of others. So that's linking both enduring and celebrating. Social capital is a practice of generativity where where there's mentors and partnerships developed which is a process of guiding, supporting and being supported, which is the mutually beneficial aspect by one another, and that's the celebrating piece, because you're supporting and encouraging one another to be successful. And the success is the positive well-being, and then celebrating the success is another step. Navigational capital is thinking about how generativity seeks endurance for the self. And so, yes, that's your self-endurance, but also thinking about the resistance capital and how generativity is endurance for others, which pulls in the future and other oriented. And then that linguistic capital is really thinking about the storytelling and language that's being passed down and by guiding and teaching others through that process in generativity. And I made some of these connections earlier to generativity and Latino leadership. So I'm using this as my framework in my work in establishing a culturally based framework to understanding leadership and teaching leadership. I do argue that this will hopefully extend beyond just the Latin community as I start looking at other communities who have a community orientation rather than an individualistic mind frame. So I think that that will produce some really interesting insight to leadership theory and education and teaching. I did want to share a practice of this framework through a class activity. I really wanted to try to get my students to agree to sharing their voices so you could hear them, but they were too nervous. So I'm going to kind of walk you through an activity that I've done with my students, another activity, because I shared one earlier with my students. So in one of our classes, I present the community cultural wealth model to my students and ask them to reflect on each of the capitals and think about the ones that they connected with most. And in a way, I asked y'all to do this earlier, right? I had y'all do the poll to kind of figure out which ones y'all really connected with. So I think that'll be interesting when I talk about this next piece. Each student of my class of 18-ish, they name aspirational, familial, and/or social capital, because some of them named multiple, and they didn't name the others. And I thought that was so interesting. But in thinking about the aspirational, familial, and social capital, you might be able to imagine how they actually, when they went into their reflections, their why, thinking out loud about why these related to them, they started making explanations where they actually did start talking about the navigational capital, the resistance capital, not so much the language capital, but we can work on that one. And essentially some components of generativity. Each of these pieces, as they started talking about aspirational capital, familial, and social, were highlighted as they started telling about, I'm pursuing higher education, I'm pursuing a neuroscience degree, I'm pursuing each of these different things because my parents struggled, and seeing them helped to tell me, or helped to give me the drive to make them proud and also persevere, navigate through things that I was told not to do or that I wasn't capable of doing. They also would recognize, they'd also name how, that was definitely not something that was fair, right? They started naming or addressing that resistance capital and talking about how they were actually trying to do something about it, either within their student organization or by talking to a mentor or friend. So I think that the connections are especially clear. And as we continued into the conversation about these, I moved into a module on generativity where we started exploring these even further. And so as they started understanding the aspects of generativity, there were a lot of those aha moments, right? Oh, the light bulb goes off. They're starting to see, oh yeah, I definitely see this as a practice. As I asked y'all that question about just generally, do you guide the next generation in any way, y'all were flooding in with some of those reflections. And they could really make that connection, especially to their culture. And as we continue in understanding the cultural capital, I think that challenging them further, not just on these ones that came very naturally, but challenging them to recognize their navigational resistance and linguistic capital will help them to further embrace and embrace their leadership identity and name it leadership. Whereas approaching it in a different way might have come in a different, might have been something that turned them off to understanding or relating to it. I do note in this activity that for my majoritized students who don't align with the Latin community or the Black community or other minoritized populations, I challenge those students to explore their privileges in these different capitals and how another culture experiences these capitals. So particularly in my class, I had them focus on the Latin community, but that gives them their own way to develop their cultural capital or their understanding of culture by exploring their privileges, and also challenges them to think in a different way about the culture so that they can understand it. And as I start wrapping up, I do want to kind of leave y'all with some cultural considerations for leadership learning. And so I definitely start with taking an asset-based approach to culture and leadership. I can't emphasize this enough, but thinking about culture from what they benefit and how they are wealthy, right, through their culture is an important starting point. So this does take some training. So turning off that negative stereotypes or turning off negative perceptions or nagging thoughts, and also turning off micro and macro aggressions that you may or may not be consciously engaging in is an important part to this. I also think considering leadership education by starting with a focus on community orientation first could be an incredible approach to helping these students understand leadership. Particularly, I recommend through generativity or generative leadership. I'm working on it. I'll try to keep NCORE updated and maybe do another follow-up presentation once I have my findings. But yes, I definitely think, starting with that community orientation, things that are essential to those cultures so that they can start from their culture rather than from something that is not inherent with them. Then I challenge you as an educator to reflect on your cultural practices and the cultural practices of others. And if you don't identify as a minoritized population, keep that challenge of privilege in mind. So as you're maybe thinking through the community cultural wealth model, considering how are these privileges benefiting you and how could you even contribute to others' cultural capital? And then also in leadership education, there's a lot of reflection and self-reflection, self-exploration as a component of leadership education and leadership development. So I think it would be a great practice to create opportunities for students to explore their community cultural wealth and generative practices. So I have some activities if you want to reach out. I shared some snippets of them here, but how are you engaging your students in this conversation? How are you bringing in these ideas that they can maybe easily relate to culturally and not necessarily connecting it to their leadership, but starting with that to help them develop their idea of leadership. Because that's what's going to help make that difference. And challenging students to use their cultural experiences, that's the speed point, their cultural experiences to develop their understandings of practices of leadership. So not just linking their cultural practices to leadership, but starting with their cultural practices as the foundation for leadership. And then finally, I definitely encourage you to bring in different voices and perspectives. If you don't already, continue to look out for other scholars who are taking cultural approaches, who have different perspectives on leadership, and sharing those experiences with your students as well. Bringing those into your learning objectives, bringing that into your practice of not just using the traditional leadership theory books and ideas, but also bringing in some other voices. And so with that, I believe we are transitioning into discussion. And I want to share, I do have several references. Sorry, my lights are motion censored. My lights just went off, but that's okay. So I do have my references here and here. I will be sharing at least an abbreviated version of this PowerPoint so y'all can have access to it later. And I'll go ahead and switch to the presenter mode. There we go.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you all for joining us. This has been very encouraging, but also reflective. And I'm inviting questions in the Q&A box. If you could type your question in the Q&A box, and then I'll elevate that to Jennifer. So thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm really excited, but also intrigued with your new conceptual framework.
I let Jack over here I love that you've got her book in the back. I did that intentionally. I could not highlight her work. I love her. I'm a fan. She is this textbook, The Power of Latino Leadership, is the textbook I use for our Latinx leadership class.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I also want to give credit to Dr. Maritza Torres, who is the founder and establisher of our course here at Florida State. She's brought it to University of Florida, Central Florida. And yeah, so it's been a fun journey.
So we are all learning a lot, how to leverage all those capitals to build leadership in our students, especially in our Latinx community. So we do have Nancy Martinez, and she's asking, where does the term generativity originate?
Yeah, so I mentioned that it derives from the study of aging. And so it really did focus initially on generations like baby boomers, millennials, Generation Z, and it's transitioned away from that. If you look up generativity, you might also come across information on the generation of ideas, like creation, as another concept or approach. I have also been trying to brainstorm with my native Spanish speakers to kind of come up with another way of translating generativity, because it's also not something that there's a name for, but a lot of my students and a lot of the people I've talked about from that culture have some sort of relation with that.
Okay, we do have another question from Renee Garcia. I'm interested in the use of the term Latinx, the one with the X at the end. I use this term as a college professor, but I find the average person finds it reprehensible. My question regards the perspective of students. And I know, Jennifer, that at the beginning, you gave us the alternative of the Latin and the asterisk. So can you address Renee's question?
Yeah, definitely. So Renee, thank you for that question. I knew it was going to come up. That's why I wanted to spend a moment at least in my presentation to let y'all know about it. I highly recommend checking out the article by Cristobal Salinas. He just published it this spring, I think it was, on the use of that term. He did an article in 2017 on Latinx, and then did a deeper dive into how students and others are really understanding it, just like you're asking your question. And a lot of the times, Latinx is something that people are okay with using as a general collective group, but not many people are using as a personal identifier. With the X, there are challenges with the language. So Spanish language, X is X, so it doesn't quite roll off the tongue. People don't know how to pronounce it. And in other Latin languages, Portuguese, Brazilian, there's not the X. It doesn't even exist. So a lot of times they resist to using it because they can't relate to it, or they also see it as a very American term. Mm-hmm. It is also very widely used in higher education. It is being more practiced outside of higher education, but in 2017, that was a very wide use. So yes, so I'm reading over some of the comments over here.
Yeah, and if you're reading the comments, do you see that a couple of people are mentioning that they have heard about, I think it's Latine or Latina with an E, Latin with an E at the end.
Yes, yes, and he addresses that in the article as well, Latine, which is another gender fluid, all-inclusive gender and fluid term that some people are using to identify with. Because there's so much variety in how individuals are identifying, and there's also Latin the at symbol with an A and the O on the outside, but the feminists are struggling with having the O as a dominating piece on the outside. But as you know, he started looking more and more into this concept. He really embraced the idea of using the asterisk, because Latin in general, using the term Latin is something that people can relate to without being too resistant, because it doesn't turn them off. So its pronunciation is easier. The asterisk is also and this is a little bit of a privilege because it's a scholarly practice, but if you do research for literature and maybe even on Google, you look up Latin asterisk, it'll pull up everything that says Latin and any other ending. So the asterisk is inclusive of at, a, o, x, Latine, ie. So those are some other different ways to kind of, that's just one way to embrace it all without challenging the language aspect of it, and while also including the various different individual identifiers.
And Jennifer, when you get a moment, if you could drop the title of that article by Dr. Salinas. And by the way, Chris Salinas is our editor for our NCORE journal. So he's a member of the NCORE family here. And can you drop that in the chat for folks that they are asking about the person who wrote Latinx and Latin? That's Dr. Salinas. And also maybe the link for the article.
Okay, I've got the link to the article in there.
Okay, thank you. So Michelle is asking, is commenting here, but also I think has a question. Thank you for presenting your work. Have you noticed any slight differences among Latinx communities in how generative leadership shows up, i.e. Chicanx, Puerto Rican, Venezuelan, etc.?
And each of every individual has their own approach in how they want to name themselves. And I give that full honor. I give all honor to how individuals want to identify. And so when I'm talking with my students in my class, or even as I'm engaging with my participants right now, as I'm going through some interviews, my study is titled with an asterisk, right? And my language throughout my publication is with an asterisk, but I am honoring their own terms when I'm speaking with them, when I'm asking them a question about their identity. So I don't say, how is your Latin identity showing up in the way you're engaged with your organization? I will say, you identify as Chicana or Chicanx, and I want to know how that shows up specifically in your engagement. So I don't think that, thinking right now, I don't think that there has been much of a difference. I am teasing out maybe some gender related machismo, marianismo expectations. But I haven't seen so much of a difference in different like countries or between like Hispanic, Chicana, or sorry, that's how I identify. So that's the one part that rolls off my tongue, but different countries as a different identifiers. There's also a Foreman and Gallegos, I think that's their names, did a really great article on Latin identity development. Simple, just identity, not leadership, just identity development. Highly recommend that article. I'm trying to think if I have that, I might be able to pull that up pretty quickly. So, that might be something else to look into, to explore a bit more.
Yeah, we do have time for a couple of more questions. And Jackie comments and has a question embedded there. I really like that leadership identity development exercise. I wonder if you knew or noticed how that starting point might be different based on a student's generational status here in the US. For example, a first gen or a third gen student.
I think that is a really great question, and I hope that I'll be able to explore that in my study. I do have students from various different generations. I think that it will more so have to do with how that culture is passed down. In some families, their culture is heavily a practice of what they're doing, whereas, later down in, for me, my generation, I don't even know if I count generations, but the border crossed my family. I am from San Antonio, Texas, and the border crossed my family. And so the Mexican border. So we're Mexican American on my mom's side, but because the land changed from Mexico to America, to the United States of America. And so that practice of generativity is something I innately relate to my cultural values. That is my own personal practice. And I am starting to see it kind of unfold in many different types of students, not just the Latin community even. I do have some students who identify as American or white, who practice it in different ways. But I think it's really depending on what's been passed down to them, what's been instilled within them. So I believe that, I would say that from my own experience, I don't know that it would be heavily influenced by generation, but that's my own personal experience, and I can't put that on my participants or the study, because I want my study to speak for itself. I want my participants to tell me what's coming from it. Mm-hmm. But I think the generational aspect will be something that will, I'm definitely looking forward to uncovering.
So Nancy Martinez is asking, in your research, Jennifer, have you found any differences between male and female Latin with the asterisk leaders as it relates to generativity or community cultural wealth? And she says that her dissertation is going to focus on the experiences of female Latinx higher education leaders.
Awesome. You should connect with my friend, Dr. Maritza Torres. Yeah, so my study doesn't have a limitation on a specific gender. So I did that intentionally because I wanted to uncover that story a little bit more. I don't have the findings yet. I'm still pretty early in my data collection, but I am, thinking about the female role, the traditional female role of the Latin community. It's very family-oriented and nurturing. It involves a lot of nurturing. So that may show up in some way as more generative, because it does involve the practice of caring, thinking about, I presented the 4 different types of generativity, right? So the parental, the biological, the teaching, and the cultural. The biological is only for females. The biological ability to give birth is only for females. The parental can technically be any, but if you're any gender identity, but if you're thinking about the any heavy set traditional expectations of females, they're going to be the ones taking on more of the discipline and nurturing of children. And so that might be more innate, but that's not something that I have seen yet. I almost was looking for it, and I haven't. I'm surprised so far that I don't see it, but I have no official findings on that yet.
So Renee is saying that she'll be teaching a Chicano studies class in the spring, and she's interested in using some of the most pivotal literature, the most outstanding, probably the most recent. Do you have any personal favorites that really impacted you that you could share with her and everybody else?
So what type of literature?
I should think Renee is saying probably what is most impactful, or what is most current, or what is most helpful in Chicano studies.
Honestly, I would start with some of the storytellers, actually. So, I don't have my Borderlands book, but I love Gloria Anzaldía, her work, any of her work. Read any of her work. Incredible scholar, Chicano scholar. Sandra Cisneros, I'm a fan. I honestly, and I think that the students really appreciate it if you're teaching stories rather than scholarly work or textbooks speak volumes to them in comparison. So, I mean, even if you look at Juana's textbook, I mean, we use it as a textbook. It's written in such a relational way. It's easy to read and digest. And those storytellings, like I said, thinking about our literature and our what readings we give the students in the linguistic capital framework, thinking about storytelling rather than textbooks can be one of the ways that we even practice that community cultural wealth, by sharing that information with them through stories rather than literature, right? So, because the lived experiences of our ancestors, of our culture, are another type of knowledge that is tremendously valuable. So, those are some of the things. I might share my email, and then if you want to reach out to me, I can kind of share some of the readings that I've got in my course.
Yeah, and I can also encourage everyone, if you want to contact Jennifer, you can email ncorewebinars@ou.edu, and we can connect you to her. And we can even post some of those resources, but you can also connect with her directly. Somebody is mentioning Gloria Anzaldía and La Frontera. Yeah, I've read that book, and really it is something. One of the last questions, Jennifer, is from Patricia. Have you seen how respeto and high power distance, high regard granted to persons because of their formal authority, age, or social power plays a role in Latinx leadership?
So how formal roles, have I seen how formal roles have impacted?
How respeto and high distance, high power distance, high regard granted to persons because of their formal authority, age, or social power plays a role in Latinx leadership.
So not all of them, but most of the Latin culture doesn't have quite the same understanding of leadership as in being born. So we don't most of them don't have like kings and queens kind of things. And even when, and I'm just thinking about some of my recent interviews with my students, because again, my focus is on college students. So a lot of the literature that I've read and thinking about leadership and really focuses on the student experiences. But thinking about my students, they even recognize the need. And I'm thinking about, there's even a quote in Lozano 2015's book. They recognize the need for a position, you know, because of the organization, the structure and delegation and how like the process of how things get done. But they don't necessarily see the position as something that holds the power, because they recognize how we need to be together. You need to have those followers. You need to have that community in order to have the impact that you want to have.
It's not just about the title. It's about how you build community through your values, your networks, your family, all of that. Well, I want to say that we have ran out of time, but I really want all of us to drop a thank you before we sign off to Jennifer Batchelder. We are so grateful for this presentation. It was very, very exciting. I've learned a lot as well, very exciting. Somebody is asking about CE credit for this webinar, and you can reach out to NCORE@ou.edu and we can respond to you. But I also want to thank each and every one of you for joining us for our Emerging Scholars webinar. Thank you, Jennifer. If you're out there, you want to connect with NCORE, please email us, visit our website. We have a lot of webinars on demand, free of charge, but we also do have webinars for a small fee. If you want to do a webinar as an emerging scholar, let us know. We can always have a conversation. But want to thank all of you for providing us with 90 minutes of your day. From the University of Oklahoma in Norman, we want to say thank you. And we want to thank our captioner, Matthew, and our ASL interpreter, Melissa, our NCORE staff, Kathy, Corey, and Josephine. And I am Dr. Jenny Rongo. I'm the director here at NCORE. And thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Jennifer. You all have a good day.
Thank you.
And the recording will be available in 5 to 7 days on our website. Thank you so much, everybody. We love you here in Oklahoma. Come see us. All right, take care.